Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Friday, so it's been about a week that we've been away from school. Hopefully, you have become comfortable with this new presentation. Um, if you're having any problems or concerns, please feel free to email me and I will do my best to make it as comfortable for you as possible. Um, Now that we are online, you have access to all the presentations and any sort of documents that are on our D12. If you find that you go on to D12 and you notice that it says that you don't have permission, it might be because you're using an account that is not your @Learn account. So just make sure that you are using your @Learn account to access all the content. If you're finding that you're still having difficulty doing that, let me know and I will do my best to get you any information or any sort of documents that you need. Um, but everything is online. And hopefully, if you have gone back to school, you've picked up anything that you needed to just help you get along while we're away. So, today we're going to continue where we left off yesterday. We are on student activity 16. This is the how do some legacies of historical globalization continue to affect Canada? So yesterday we spent time talking about the legacies of historical globalization in Canada. Today we're going to focus on how they are still affecting us today. We're going to focus on two groups, primarily because they do have the most detailed impacts. So we're going to start there with the Quebec and First Nations, the impact of the legacy of historical globalization. So we'll start there. So if you're following along, this is page 12 in your booklet. So we'll begin. So we're going to focus on immigration first, because whenever we look at Canada, Canada is still a land of immigrants. Everybody that is in our classes, you look around the room, or when we were in the room, a lot of you came from different countries, or a lot of your parents did. My parents both came from a different country, so they're also immigrants. So that's why diversity is a huge characteristic of Canadian society. You look outside your neighborhood, there's people from all over the world. And we talked about that in the first unit, about the impact that has on us and globalization. That is globalization. We are coming together and the world just becoming a little bit smaller. So the history of immigration, though, it's a little not as welcoming at first. So the government did encourage certain groups to come to Canada, whereas they would have banned others from. So, for example, Europeans were always welcome. They were always welcome to come into Canada. But when we look at, say, people from Asia, um, there was a sort of ban that was put on Chinese immigration to British Columbia in the 1890s, early 1900s, just because they were afraid of too many coming in. So there was that. Reforms came in 1968 and it became more equal. So we kind of see that immigration started off kind of more shift geared towards Europeans, but then it changes to be more equal. And then we get this idea of a cultural mosaic. This is used to define the willingness to accept all cultures. People will argue and say things like Canada is a cultural mosaic where you come to Canada and you don't drop whatever culture you came from. So if you've come from Sweden, or if you've come from Brazil, or if you've come from um, Japan, you can bring these things and still celebrate your culture. Some people will say that the United States is a melting pot where you arrive with your culture, but then you are essentially American when you step out and you live there. You've kind of left your stuff at the door. Some people will disagree with that, but that is kind of the contrast that we've been um, used to talking about. So, when we talk about this cultural mosaic, we have to bring up the idea of multiculturalism. So, we introduced multiculturalism in the first unit, but now we'll take it and we'll elaborate on it. So, it was a policy that began in 1971 with the then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau. This is Justin Trudeau's father, so our current Prime Minister's father. He made it a law to essentially protect and maintain this multiculturalism in Canada, and it provided all cultures with an atmosphere of tolerance. So if you were Brazilian and you came to Canada, it wasn't like you were shunned because you were Brazilian and you had this culture with you. You were accepted. Now, it sounds all good and stuff, but let's be realistic that that's not always the case, um, because we do have examples of racism in this country. So, yes, on paper it is an atmosphere of tolerance, but sometimes in the day to day lives of people, it is not so. And that is something that we need to be aware of as well. So, there is, obviously, with anything, there is some controversy. So, English Canada not wanting to give up its Canadian British heritage. So, we talked about the control of North America going to the British and the French being um, kicked out. When we look at Canada, it developed very much as a British colony. Yes, it had its own prime minister, it had its own government, but really it was a part of the British Empire for a long portion of its history. So it was ingrained in society to have that sort of British feel to it. The more and more immigrants that started to arrive, English Canada started to feel hesitant. They felt like they were potentially going to be outnumbered. So there was that reluctance to let go of the British heritage, the traditions, the customs, that connection with England. Um, then we talk about Quebec. Um, Quebec also had that sort of fear, but more on the lines of French culture, French language being taken away or slowly being assimilated into West or into English Canadian society. Um, so now we are just going to jump into land claims, because land claims are also a legacy that continues to affect Canada. So there is opposition to the numbered treaties that still exists. We talked about those yesterday. There was an exchange. The First Nations gave the land to the Canadian government, and in return, they were to be given parts of the land to live on, payment, supplies, and all these things. They saw it as sharing, the First Nations, but the Canadian government saw it as purchasing, like we talked about yesterday. So there is opposition because it's just unclear of what does this, what do these treaties mean? Because two groups are coming with two separate ideas. When we focus on British Columbia, the treaties were not signed. So when we look at those maps, British Columbia is not in those. It's not one of those numbered treaties on the map. So the issue is still unresolved, and there is a large concentration of First Nations groups there that are challenging policies even up until today. Before the coronavirus became the talk um, of every single news outlet. There was the whole building of the pipeline that would go from Alberta through BC to the coast. There were a lot of First Nations chiefs and elders and tribes and bands that were challenging the legitimacy of court orders and provincial government mandates. So there is that unresolvedness because land claims is still up in the air. So even when treaties were signed, government is accused of breaking the promises or negotiating unfairly. So remember from yesterday, these treaties were verbally communicated at first. So it was, we're going to talk out all that's going to be in there, and then the final decision is a written summary, and you're going to sign it off. Well, sometimes things were left out, and then like we said, the question of what this relationship is going to be. Is this a full on purchase of the land, or is this a sharing of the land? So this up in the air confusion really makes land claims one of the lasting legacies of historical globalization. And it gets worse when we talk about not just what's on the land, like people and infrastructure and buildings and roads and all that, but what's underneath the land is also something that we need to worry about, because then, like in Alberta, um, on a piece of land, if we find oil underneath, who owns it? These kind of questions, um, these kind of questions really start to make things a lot more difficult. And I remember one of the first things that we talked about in our course is the question of what's more important, human rights or economic development. So land claims really will divide people on that question. What's more important, economic development or human rights? So land claims in Canada, massive part of the legacy of historical globalization. If we jump back to us for a second to Quebec, we need to talk about something called the Quiet Revolution. And if you're not too sure what that is, don't worry. In the description, I will put a few links to other videos that will help describe what the Quiet Revolution was, when it took place, and really what happened. It was the concern over English dominance in Canada, and it was raised by the French people of Quebec. Um, they were very much afraid of assimilating into English society, the English dominated Canada. Because if we remember from our talks of way back when the French had control of Quebec, when it was called New France, after the 7 Years' War, when the British took over, they did give them some. They agreed to certain things. They gave them language, their religion, their culture. These sort of things were given, and they were kind of put into law with the Quebec Act. But when we look at the reasons that there was a lot of unhappiness, it comes back to the things like French language was not welcomed in government. It was only English. Now it's the opposite. Now it's both French and English. So there was that fear. So in the 1960s, this came to be the dominant thing in Quebec. And it does spark a separatist movement. So a separatist movement is an organization of people that want to separate from a country. So Quebec has that movement, and it is still alive in Quebec. In the 90s, they did hold a referendum where they actually voted, and the decision went 51-49 in favor of staying a part of Canada. So it the 90s kind of whatever started in the 60s in the Quiet Revolution came to a head in the 90s when they had that election, because they had tried other things before to get the separatist movement, this idea of separation, to take root and to expand. And in the description, I will leave a link to what was known as the FLQ, which essentially was a separatist movement, but a more radical, violent organization that resorted to bank robberies for funding, kidnapping, and violence against English Canada. And it required the federal government to actually bring in the military to bring it down or to quiet it down. So I will leave links to videos about this in the description, because this is one of the longest lasting legacies of historical globalization, the relationship between French and English Canada. We can't ignore it, because as recently as in my lifetime, and maybe even in your lifetimes as well, this question of separation may be a thing that Canada will have to wrestle with when it comes to relationships with Quebec. So now we'll move over to the legacies of residential schools. This is one of the, if not the biggest legacy of historical globalization, and its continued effect on Canada. Because like we talked about yesterday, the last residential school closed in 1996. That's not too far long ago. We're talking like 20 something years ago. So it is something we need to be aware of. So the victimization of women as well. So in 2009, close to 67,000 or 13% of Indigenous women over the age of 15 stated they had been violently victimized. That is substantial, and that is a lasting effect of the historical globalization. I believe that we may have talked about in our current events missing and murdered Indigenous women, the campaign that is going across Canada to find these women that are missing and presumed to either be murdered or victims of some sort of acts of violence. This is crucial because it's an ongoing thing that we are having to deal with in Canada. So overall, Indigenous women reported experiencing close to 138,000 incidences of violence. So again, we are seeing the effects of residential schools because some of the things that happened in the residential schools was physical violence, was psychological violence, and was sexual violence as well. Yesterday, I did leave a video link in the description about one of the survivors of the residential school. So hopefully you had a chance to listen to her story. There are countless stories of victims of the residential school system, one of the darkest legacies in our country. So then we do see the Native Women's Association of Canada was able to document. So there is work to try to document these stories. 582 cases of missing or murdered Indigenous women and girls, mostly from the last 2 decades. So the last 20 years, they have started to document this, and this ties to the current event that we would have done in class, where there are things like billboards and campaigns being done. There's websites that are being there's a website up that is advocating for people to come forward with information so they can find out what happened to these people. And perhaps I'll even put in the description as well a link to this website, because we are talking about human lives after all. These are people's relatives, these are people's children, these are people's parents, grandparents. this is one of the darkest aspects of Canada's existence. The fact that these people are missing, it's very heartbreaking to see. So in 2014, an Indigenous woman was 6 times more likely to be murdered as a non-Indigenous woman. So that is very unfortunate. That is heartbreaking and sad to know that these sort of statistics exist. And it all ties back to the founding of Canada, the way that the Indigenous people were seen and treated. Um, when we talk about Indigenous women, even more so. When the Indian Act was created in 1876, we talked about yesterday. If I'm wrong, forgive me. If an Indigenous woman was to marry a non-Indigenous male, she lost her status, and she was forced, therefore, to leave the reserve land that she was living on. Whereas if an Indigenous male was to marry a non-Indigenous woman, that female would actually gain status and could move on to reserves. So I mean, when we talk about the treatment of Indigenous people, it has been cruel and very harsh. But when we talk about Indigenous women, even more so, because the Canadian government has made more of an effort to control their lives. One of the other lasting effects of residential schools and its legacies is this idea of post-traumatic stress disorder. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Sorry, PTSD. In other contexts, we've heard of PTSD from soldiers returning home from war. So the first instance when this was actually documented and kind of studied was after the First World War. They would have called it shell shock. Soldiers returning home, physically fine, psychologically shattered. And back then they weren't. There wasn't any sort of treatment for it. It was seen as a weakness or a cowardice in the mind of that person. So it wasn't treated the way it is now. Now we can talk about PTSD and the effects it has. I think a good movie that if you're interested in watching, that could show you a really good understanding of PTSD would be American Sniper, and the story of I forget his name, but it's like a biographical account of his life. He does suffer with PTSD, but if we look at the survivors of residential schools, they do experience many different aspects of trauma related to their stay in schools. So they have distressful dreams. They feel that events are reoccurring. Intense distress when shown an item that sparks a memory of their experience. So some things that could spark these are actual buildings, actual schools. So these children who went through this traumatic event, maybe when they see schools as adults, it brings back horrific memories. Things like scissors, because one of the things that happened in these residential schools was hair was cut, and don't think it was cut like if you go to a barber shop or a hair salon now where it's all nicely done. We're talking chunks of skin are coming out with it as well. Scissors or razors, electric razors. We're talking chunks of skin were coming out. If they were to come across people like nuns or priests, for those of us that didn't go to residential schools, we see these people as nice, as is almost innocent of any crimes. But we have to face the realization that a lot of residential schools were run by Christian organizations and Christian churches. So seeing these people could also spark some very painful memories. And if you had a chance to watch the video that I put in the description yesterday about The Secret Path, which is the story of Chani Wenjack, you would have seen some of the images. The nuns and priests in those videos are shown to be quite cruel and quite harsh. Um, so this PTSD, it is a plague on the First Nations people, not just those that went through the school systems, but also their children and their grandchildren. So we see outbursts of intense anger as well, because these were children that were brought to a school. When we think of school, we look at it as if it's this safe environment. Um, it's a place where you meet with your friends, you have sports, teammates, you do extracurricular activities. It's seen as a pillar of our community, and we enjoy our time there. But for these people, it was a place of unspeakable pain and suffering and hatred. They were brought there for assimilation. They were brought there to wipe out any connection to their culture and be reprogrammed into being white when they weren't. So when we talk about where we are now with this idea of multiculturalism, this is kind of a wake-up call and a red flag that says, hey, what you're saying and what you're doing, they don't add up. And the effects of residential schools, there hasn't been a whole lot of reconciliation. We've started now, but not so much. So we do see self-medicated by the use and abuse of drugs and alcohol to try to deal with these issues. And that has become a unfortunate stereotype that has been brought up about Indigenous people. The idea that they are either on or are using drugs and alcohol all the time. It's a stereotype that has unfortunately been put on them, but it's if that's all you do, you are not looking at the entire depth of what has happened. And I hope that you can kind of see if they're going to extreme lengths with alcohol and substance abuse, what are they trying to mask? If they're okay with the crippling effects of drugs and alcohol, I mean, that in and of itself should be enough. So the children of residential school survivors were more likely to witness violence or be victims of violence. When all you know is violence, it's become normalized. When violence is normalized, that is a very difficult thing to try to change. It's hard to see things differently. And we're talking about children as young as 8 or 9, even sometimes younger, going through the entire school system where violence was used. So now we see their children, and again, it's by no means their fault, but these parents and these children that went through the residential school system, they're trying to live a life where violence is all they've ever known and hatred is all they've ever seen. And then when you couple it in with drugs and alcohol abuse, physical violence is very much a possibility. It has affected their education. So again, we talk about stereotypes that exist. These stereotypes that exist are all legacies of historical globalization. So we look at, for example, on slide 11, high school completion rates. Only 7% of parents who attended residential schools have obtained a university degree, whereas on the opposite, 35% of Canadians' national average. Again, when you went through a school system where physical, emotional, and sexual abuse happened on a daily basis, you are going to try to avoid or not want to return to something related to school. and that impacts the parents or the graduates of residential schools, and then their children as well. So only 34% of Indigenous adults have their high school diploma, whereas 86.7% of non-Indigenous Canadians do. That is also huge, and that should be very alarming. And when we talk about legacies of historical globalization, this is one of them as well, because these residential schools, the curriculum that was taught, it was not set up for success. It was set up for keeping the Indigenous people in a certain bracket. They were going to work. There was no higher education that was the prospects. They went there and essentially they were slave labor. They would go and they would work. So if you were a male, you would work on the fields. You would be sent out to farms to essentially be slave labor. If you were for the girls, it was sewing, it was cooking, it was all these domestic chores. Again, they're not taking biology, they're not taking physics, they're not taking calculus in these schools. It is re-education in terms of language and religion, and then it is manual labor. That is going to be your existence. That is the structure of these residential schools. And I would strongly encourage you to look up these stories of these people, because this is a legacy of our country. I know I can't ask this question to you, but how many of you have ever read stories about the Holocaust? Anne Frank is probably one of the more famous ones, that maybe you even read some of her stuff, or you know stories about the Holocaust, because it's so famous. We have in our own country essentially a cultural genocide and a physical genocide that happened for, we're talking, hundreds of years. And their stories are there. They're in books. They're in museums. They are on YouTube. There is websites that have been created. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission has taken thousands of stories of survivors, or the story of people who did not make it through. We have a huge amount of information that can be given, and all it takes is for us to look. So on the last slide of this presentation, I would strongly encourage you to watch this video, because it will help you understand one of the darkest periods of Canadian history, and one of the lasting effects of historical globalization on our country. The residential school system, like I said yesterday, is probably one of, if not the biggest legacy of historical globalization. So that's it. That's it for this lecture. If you have any questions, feel free to either email them to me or comment them in the comment section. What we're going to do with the booklets is, for the questions, I want you to write them in a Google Doc and keep it going throughout these lectures until we get to the new one, until we get to the next unit. When we do that, then you're going to send me that collection of stuff, and I'll mark it that way. And that also goes with your definitions as well. Also, for the last booklet that we finished, so part 1 of historical globalization, the best thing to do would be to take pictures of each page, and then just send it to me in an email. Unfortunately, that's probably the easiest way. Unless you really wanted to write them all on a Google Doc, you could do that too. But the picture is probably the best way to do it. So yeah, stay safe, and I will see you Monday. See you later.